Like slavery and apartheid, poverty is not natural. It is man-made, and it can be overcome and eradicated by the actions of human beings. And overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity. It's the protection of a fundamental human right. The right to dignity and a decent life.
That was Nelson Mandela speaking in 2005 to over 20,000 people in London, urging world leaders to end extreme global poverty. In Johannesburg, on December 2nd of this year, the advocacy organization Global Citizen will hold a free event for 100,000 people to honor Mandela's legacy and aim to make major strides to end extreme poverty. And today we're helping announce the artists who will be headlining the Global Citizen Festival Mandela 100 event. Among them, Beyonce, Jay-Z, Ed Sheeran, Eddie Vedder, Pharrell Williams, and Chris Martin. Joining us now, a member of the festival's host committee and a United Nations Sustainable Development Goal advocate, Oscar-winning actor Forest Whitaker. Also with us, the host of MSNBC's Politics Nation and president of the National Action Network, Reverend Al Sharpton, and Chuck Robbins, CEO of Cisco, which is a major sponsor of the event. Good to have you all on board. Thank you very much for joining us.
So, Forrest, how did you get involved, and what do you hope what do you hope the world to get out of this event?
I mean, I've been working with Global Citizens since 2016, and I mean, one of the things that they do is bring together individuals, normal citizens, to be able to find actions that they can do to help change the planet, to make it a world that they want to be in. And so I started working with them on that. One of their major goals is, as you heard, about the eradication of poverty in the world. And this is one of the main issues that affects me also, because I work also in conflict resolution. And in that area, the lack of resources, lack of ability to be able to taken care of and have the dignity of a human being is eradicated from them. And so these two things come together for me.
Talk about also remembering Nelson Mandela on the 100th anniversary and what that means to all of us in a time like this.
I think that he serves as an iconic beacon for all of us to understand that as an individual, you can make an effect on the planet and the world. I mean, he was able to fight against, institutional racism with apartheid, and he was able to move out of that and move into a space of like trying to bring the country together through forgiveness. And I think these are lessons that all of us need to follow as we continue to make our journey.
Isn't it extraordinary? It's not only that he triumphed in a generational battle, but also brought a country together that had been torn apart. Whites and blacks coming together in South Africa. That was as great of an achievement, a peaceful resolution, as was the victory.
It's powerful. When he put together the Truth and Reconciliation Committee to be able to deal with the issues that had happened during the conflict of apartheid, I mean, he was able to make the nation look at hearing the problems, but then finding forgiveness in their hearts so that they would be able to work together as people. And I think this is a very powerful message for all of us.
Mandela's legacy is certainly something to look at during this time. And Chuck Robbins, some would argue that it's a time where private citizens and corporations can step up, where perhaps there might be an empathy void in the administration. I won't put those words in your mouth, but why don't you tell us what is motivating Cisco to step up?
Well, first of all, Mika, Joe, thanks for having us today, and we're very excited to be partnering with Global Citizen. You know, a couple of years ago, just in line with our culture, we made a commitment to positively impact 1 billion lives by 2025 around the world. Recently, we just made a $50 million commitment towards homelessness here in Silicon Valley, and when I met Forrest and Hugh Evans and the rest of the team, this just is a very natural thing for us to be a part of in trying to end poverty. It lines up with our culture. It lines up with our initiative to positively affect 1 billion people. And frankly, I do think that corporate America and corporations around the world have to take a much more active role in helping solve some of the biggest problems. And we're really excited to be partnering with them.
Reverend Al, just listening to Forrest's response and his explanation of why he got involved, Nelson Mandela, it is amazing when you reflect upon his life to think that here was an individual who spent a good part of his life in basically a 12-foot by 10-foot cell and emerged without seemingly any bitterness and emerged to help lead the world toward a better place. Incredible to think about that.
No, it really is. And part of this celebration of Mandela is to celebrate the best in the human spirit, how he turned his pain into power and suffering into redemption. And I remember the times that I was around him, there was no even off-the-record kind of bitterness or acrimony. So I think when all of us head to Johannesburg, I went with Hugh Evans and Martin Luther King III and one of Mandela's grandsons to meet with the Secretary General to talk about how this is a world event to really challenge all of us to rise up like Mandela above ourselves to make change around poverty by also changing those notions in us that lead toward a negative climate. That's what he exemplified. And this year of celebrating Mandela is to celebrate the best in us. That's why we're going with the best talent to Johannesburg, December 2nd.
So Forrest, you brought it up. We're talking about it. The power of reconciliation, something we need in our own politics every day. And every time I think, oh, the divisions are too wide. I remember Lincoln, the second inaugural, 650,000 Americans killed, talking about with malice toward none, stitching the Union together. And that's what Mandela did. What a powerful legacy.
It's an unbelievable legacy to bring that together. And still after his own freedom, when he was released from prison after 27 years, he still focused on the freedom of others. And I think there's something that's really powerful, what you're talking about separation. I think to bring together all of us under a banner of understanding that we're working towards giving everybody their rights of the right for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the ability to be able to work, the ability to be able to take care of themselves, the ability to have a home, the ability to be fed. All of these things coming together are things that all of us can relate to. And as a people, and as a nation, and as a world, we have to bring ourselves together under these banners.
And that's something that Global Citizen's talking about, as well as the continued fight to end extreme poverty. Reverend Al, we still have a long way to go in that area, don't we?
We do have a long way to go, but we must be committed to it. But I think Mandela, particularly in this century, our celebration, gives us the power of possibility. Here's a man who literally went from prisoner to president. So you have to keep believing, you have to keep striving. We can do it, and we're going to prove it.
The Global Citizen Festival, Mandela 100, will take place on December 2nd in Johannesburg. For more information on how you can earn your free tickets, go to globalcitizen.org. Forrest Whitaker, Reverend Al Sharpton, Chuck Robbins, thank you all so much.
And thank you, Chuck, for what you and Cisco are doing. It means an awful lot. We greatly appreciate it.
And that does it for us this morning.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.